Okay, that's the end of our three speeches. We now have an opportunity to take some questions from the floor. I think we have some.
Yeah, thank you very much, Özlem. Thank you very much, Task and FIBS, inviting me and giving me the opportunity to talk about a topic which looks a bit clumsy, finance-dominated capitalism, redistribution of income, and the requirement of wage income-led recovery, a post-Keynesian Kaleckin perspective. So what I basically would like to do, I would like to take a macroeconomic perspective on this issue, and at the very end I would like to come up with some policy implications. Let me start with a kind of macroeconomic view on financialization. The issues of financialization have already been mentioned by Özlem Onaran in her introduction, so I don't have to repeat them. From a macro perspective, I like to think about these in terms of four channels of influence. So first, financialization has affected income distribution, and I will talk about this in more detail here and today. Income distribution between shareholders or rentiers and firms and workers, and also managers and workers. So different dimensions. Second, financialization has affected firms' investment in capital stock, mainly through increasing shareholder power and shareholder value orientation. This has dampened capital accumulation in capital stock, and to that extent also long-run productivity growth. Third, financialization has, through financial asset price booms, house price booms, and financial market liberalization, has allowed for wealth-based and debt-led consumption booms in several countries, in the US, in the UK, and also in Ireland. Of course, we all know the risk of this is financial fragility and the over-indebtedness of the private household, and this was the trigger of the recent crisis. Fourth, financialization through the deregulation and liberalization of international financial markets has allowed for financing persistent current account deficits on the one hand, and on the other hand, the dominance of export-led mercantilist strategies on the other hand. A major example for this is the country where I come from, namely Germany. The risk of this is, of course, global imbalances and the over-indebtedness of current account deficit countries. I will come back to this at the very end when I talk about policy implications. But let me first focus on the distributional dimension. I think the data are quite well known, so I can be very quick on that. The first dimension is, and I will focus on that later on, is the shift in functional income distribution. So the dramatic decrease in the labor income share, which you can see here for cyclical average values starting in the early 1980s till the cycle just before the Great Recession. And you see the most dramatic decrease has been observed in Ireland. But it's true for all the other countries in my data set. A second dimension is the increase in personal income distribution, namely the household distribution of income. Here you have data for the Gini coefficient, and you see that it has increased in almost all the countries for which the OECD database provides data, unfortunately not for Ireland. But in the introduction by Nat O'Connor this morning, we have had more detailed information on Ireland, and it's true for Ireland as well. Third, and I think we will hear more about that this afternoon, so I can also be very brief on that, we have seen an increase in top incomes, in particular in the US and in the UK. Here the top 0.1 income share, which now has reached levels, or before the crisis, had reached levels not seen since the late 1920s, early 1930s. As the data, World Top Income data set shows, these tendencies can also be observed in other countries, but to a lesser extent. We have seen data on Ireland this morning. And fourth, this increase in top incomes is, at least to a certain extent, driven or has been driven by the so-called working rich phenomenon, meaning the increase in top management salaries. You see this here for the US, and it is the light lower area which has seen a dramatic increase in its share in the top 0.1%. As the World Top Income data set shows, similar tendencies can be observed in Spain, the Netherlands, and also in Germany, but not yet in Italy and France. Now, let me come back to functional income distribution because I consider functional income distribution at the very roots of these redistributional tendencies, for the simple reason that a change in functional income distribution always feeds through on personal distribution as long as financial and real wealth is unequally distributed across households. And we know this is the case, and I think we might hear more about this afternoon as well. So therefore my focus is on functional income distribution, and I apply a theoretical approach which goes back to the works of Michael Koletsky, who has proposed I would say, socio-institutionalist conflict theory of functional income distribution, which I consider to be highly superior to the neoclassical aggregate marginal productivity theory of functional income distribution, because the latter is theoretically flawed, as we know since the capital controversy, and it's also empirically highly dubious. Now, applying this approach and trying to make sense of the influence of financialization leads to this table, which I hope you can read. According to this Koletsky approach, the profit share, including profits of different types, but also including overhead costs and therefore top management salaries, is mainly determined by markup pricing of firms in incompletely competitive goods markets, by the price of imported raw materials and semi-finished products, so to speak, the profit claims of the external sector of your economy, and by the sectoral composition of the economy. If I apply this approach and introduce some stylized facts of financialization, I find that financialization has led to a decrease in the share of direct labor, so the wage share, and to an increase of this gross profit share, mainly through three channels. It has limited, constrained the bargaining power and activity of trade unions through increasing shareholder value orientation and short-termism of management, through increasing relevance of the financial with respect to the non-financial sector, through liberalization and globalization of international finance and trade, through the deregulation of the labor market, and through downsizing the government. Furthermore, it has contributed to the decrease in the wage share through increasing overhead cost and gross profit targets. This is also based on the increase in shareholder value orientation, so making shareholders happy, increasing dividend payouts of firms. It has, in particular in the 1980s, it can be related to increasing interest payments, and it can be related to the increase in top management salaries, which you've seen in the previous slide. The third channel is the effect of financialization on the sectoral composition of our economy. And here mainly two issues are at work. First, the increasing relevance of finance with respect to the non-financial sector. Gary has shown some data on that. And this, of course, affects the aggregate, the overall profit share, to the extent that the profit share in the financial sector exceeds the profit share in the non-financial sector. We know, in particular for the US, this is the case, or this has been the case. And furthermore, it is the downsizing of government, because if you downsize government, the government contribution to GDP, since the government is a non-for-profit sector, this by definition means that the wage share decreases and the profit share in your economy increases. Those who are interested, I've reviewed all this literature and empirical support of these channels in a paper which is on advanced access with the Cambridge Journal of Economics, so I don't want to go through this. So what are the economic policy implications of these findings? Previous to the crisis, we had, on the one hand, the debt-led consumption boom model. On the other hand, we have the export-led mercantilist model, and both have shown not to be sustainable. Now, the alternative to this is a third model, kind of third way, but not the third way we usually have in mind when we talk about third ways. It is a wage or income-led recovery model, and it has been proposed in particular by the ILO in the Global Wage Report 2012, and it has been suggested, or some background research has been provided by a group of Koletsky authors. Two of them are here on the podium, Özlem Onaran and myself. If we apply this approach and go for a wage-led or income-led recovery, this would mean that we would have to improve the bargaining power of trade unions. We would have to decrease overhead costs of firms, in particular top management salaries and profit claims of the financial wealth holders. And we would have to do something about the sectoral composition of the economy. So we would have to shrink finance and expand the non-financial corporate sector and maybe even the public sector. Of course, a wage-led or income-led recovery should also address the other issues or the other dimensions of income distribution, which I only briefly touched. So it should contribute to the containment of wage dispersion and to the reduction of inequality in distribution of disposable income through progressive taxation and social policies. What I would argue, this is not enough. I mean, this is highly ambitious, and in order to get this, we would have to embed this in what some colleagues and myself have called a Keynesian New Deal at the global and at the European level, for two reasons. First of all, even if we were successful in redistributing income towards labor, from capital to labor, the effects on aggregate demand are rather small. They are not negative, but they are small. That is what empirical research tells us. Second, in order to get this, we would have to assist labor, we would have to assist trade unions in order creating an environment with high employment, which by definition would increase bargaining power. Therefore, and I only can be very brief on that, 1 minute, just 3 keywords and then I'm done. We would have to re-regulate finance. Gary has talked about this. We would have to reorientate macroeconomic policies, mainly fiscal policies, and we would therefore have to abandon fiscal austerity policies and would have to go for fiscal policies which applies government budget deficits whenever needed. So abandon government budget deficits or debts as a target for fiscal policies. And third, we would have to reconstruct international macroeconomic policy coordination such that beggar thy neighbor policies are avoided in the future. Thank you very much.